All right. So, John, should we start?
I'm sorry?
Should we start now?
Yo, whenever you're ready. That's fine with me.
All right. All right. All right. So, okay. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from New York City. It's early morning here. I would like to welcome all of you to our latest online event at Basel HCD. I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. John LaMattina, Senior Partner at PureTech Health and Director of Immunome, Ligand Pharmaceuticals, and Vedanta Biosciences. Dr. LaMattina received his PhD in organic chemistry from University of New Hampshire. Then he joined Princeton University as an NIH postdoc. He's the former Senior Vice President of Pfizer and President of Pfizer Global Research and Development. In his role, Dr. LaMattina oversaw the drug discovery and development efforts of over 13,000 employees in the United States, Europe, and Asia. He is the author of several books, including the one titled Pharma and Profits, Balancing Innovation, Medicine, and Drug Prices, and he's going to talk about it today. I'm posting a link to his many interesting books, and hopefully you can follow that and see some of his writings. I'm going to post it on the chat box here. And I think, let me just fix this. There's a small typo here. All right. John also maintains a column at Forbes magazine where he writes on various aspects of healthcare. I'm also posting the link to his Forbes page. Please follow the link to see his interesting opinion pieces. All right, so despite this brilliant resume and many achievements, John is remarkably humble, okay? I cherish his friendship and his kindness. Let's move to today's agenda. John will share his insight into drug pricing and pharma innovation. After his presentation, you can ask your questions. When you have a question, please type your questions to the chat in the chat box. I'll try my best to read as many questions as possible, considering our limited time. Without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. LaMattina to start his presentation. I'm going to share the slides with you, and you can hopefully see and let me know whether there is any issue. All right. Okay, John. So here we go. Can you see the screen? Can you see the full screen?
I can. Yes, thank you.
All right. All right. Yes, please, John.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to come and talk to this group. It's a real pleasure for me to do this and sort of share my thoughts about, I think, the value that the biopharmaceutical industry brings. It's too bad Solomon is not part of this, because in our discussions a few months back, he was the one who asked me this question: do drug companies save or destroy lives? And that might seem a bit extreme, but I can tell you, at least here in the United States, that's not really the case. On the next slide, I share probably the two people on the broadest extremes in politics in the United States: Donald Trump on one side and Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont on the other side, a liberal and a critic of the industry. And in this case, I think this is the only time I've found the two of them to agree on anything. And that came to about the drug industry, with Trump basically saying the industry's been disastrous. We need to create new bidding procedures for the drug industry because they are getting away with murder. And when Senator Sanders heard about this, he agreed, said, it's right. I've been saying this for years. Pharma does get away with murder, literally murder. People die because they can't get the prescription drugs they need. I think pretty extreme. And while this is a United States debate here, there are examples in Europe where, in the case of gene therapies, there are some gene therapies not available to patients because of disputes between governments and various drug companies along the way. So I don't think this is a US only issue. I thought on the next slide that the pandemic would change things. I thought a silver lining that occurred here was how the biopharmaceutical industry rallied to save the world. So on the next slide, in 2021, the reputation of biopharma hit the highest level in 30 years, not since the late 1990s that people think as favorably as they did to the industry. And that's because of vaccines, obviously, but not just vaccines, antivirals, antibodies. The fact of the matter is, while the vaccine companies got most of the credit, an awful lot of work went into the other areas. I had never seen such a unity among all these companies banding together, or working separately, of course, but everybody devoting resources to try and come up with ways to not only fight COVID, but also the downstream effects of COVID as well. And the other amazing thing was people began to understand the value of the biopharmaceutical industry. In a crisis like this, there's only one place you could really turn to, in my mind, to not only generate potential vaccines, but to manufacture and distribute them around the world. And so it was a pretty heady time for the industry, and a lot of us were taking great pride on how the industry responded. That lasted less than a year. The fact of the matter is, later in 2021, after vaccines had been introduced, I was interviewed by a British journalist who said to me, Pfizer will make $36 billion in 2021. How much should they be allowed to keep? Now, clearly, $36 billion is a lot of money. In fact, Pfizer sales in 2020 only amounted to $41 billion total for their entire portfolio. So it's a lot. But the thought of how much profit should they be allowed to keep, I think, is a bit of extreme. And then, of course, there's those people who believe that the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines were brought to market with minimal risk. NIH provided decades of research funding, and Operation Warp Speed provided, in the United States anyway, $18 billion. And you can see that the implications are that drug companies basically capitalized on the pandemic, made outrageous profits, and the real world of drug R&D is done by the NIH, and all industry does is simply manufacture these new medicines. And unfortunately, a lot of people believe that, such that the Gallup poll that came out 2 weeks ago, looking across businesses and industries in the United States, when you looked at the industries and businesses that got either very positive or somewhat positive rating, the restaurant industry was the highest at 60%. And you can see farming, computers, and then you work your way down to lawyers, drug companies, politicians, and the oil and gas industry at the bottom. So for an industry that basically, I would argue, saved the world, perhaps the reputation has gotten even lower than it had been pre-pandemic, which is actually stunning. Now, what's lacking from many of these discussions is some basic facts. So let's talk about the COVID-19 vaccine, for example. And I'll use Pfizer, not because I'm an ex-Pfizer guy, but really because I think they distributed, made, manufactured more, maybe 60 to 70% of all the vaccines that went around the globe. Pfizer took no money from the US government for vaccine development. In fact, they put $2 billion at risk in what was then, I mean, we all accept it now, but was then an unproven technology. And the CEO at the time had only, still a CEO, but he had only been in his job for about 18 months. Basically on a Friday brought in his staff and said, on Monday, I want all your best ideas for trying to deal with this pandemic. And they eventually did the deal with BioNTech. Pfizer already had a deal with BioNTech in the area of flu vaccines. And so it was a natural thing to do. And within a couple of weeks, they were off and running. Nevertheless, this is unproven, invested $2 billion, and they did things like start to manufacture build manufacturing plants before they even knew what type the vaccine would be. Totally unprecedented risk. And I bring this up in the newness of the CEO, because if the mRNA vaccine had failed, spending $2 billion on unproven and potentially bogus technology might have really risked his career as the Pfizer CEO, especially coming off of not that tremendous sales the year before. Nevertheless, if you can go back just 1 second to me, nevertheless, you can see that, the thought of Pfizer gouging people. And I'll add another fact. There was an editorial in the New York Times before the vaccines were available, basically saying, be careful what you wish for. That vaccines, these would be life-saving vaccines, and who knows, companies might charge $500 to be vaccinated with this vaccine, any COVID vaccine. So the fact of the matter is, Pfizer priced it at what they called the cost of a takeout meal, but basically in wealthier nations, total of $39. That's for the total of the 2 shots. Middle-income countries, $20, selling it at low-income countries at cost, and poorest countries for free. I would argue that's hardly price gouging along the way. Now, in the next slide, I'll compare that to vaccine prices. Now, I realize this is in the United States, but I don't know if there may be somewhat different, obviously, in Europe, because they'll be cheaper, but I don't know how drastically cheaper. But in the US, the COVID vaccine costs less than flu vaccines, particularly the low-dose vaccine for people over 65, the high-dose vaccines. And in 2021, the flu vaccine was only 20% effective. So the COVID vaccines are close to 100% effective now. For MMR vaccines, $90, meningitis, $150 to $200, shingles, $325 for 2 doses. Clearly, COVID vaccines were not priced excessively, and certainly a bit yet less than the New York Times editorial potentially forecast. Next slide. But perhaps the major value in all this that gets lost in any of these discussions is the impact of the COVID vaccines. The Commonwealth Fund, which looks to evaluate healthcare costs and come up with ideas to better these costs, did an analysis that from the time the mRNA vaccines were introduced in mid-December of 2020 to 15 months later, when they actually, 16 months later, I guess, when they actually did these analyses, there were and this is just the United States data, 2.2 million fewer deaths, 17 million fewer hospitalizations, 66 million fewer infections, and almost $9 billion in healthcare costs averted. So when you deal with the British, not picking on the British journalist, but the journalist who I spoke to, who asked how much profit Pfizer should take, my guess is that maybe a total of $100 billion have been invested in vaccines to date. And this is just the data from the end of March of 2022. Clearly, the savings that these vaccines have brought to the world are dramatic, and yet totally unappreciated along the way. Now, this leads then to another thing I talk about a lot, and I write about a lot on Forbes.com. And it's the real facts. What's really going on with drug prices? And this is largely a United States discussion, but you will see the implications for Europe as I go forward. Next slide, please. Here's an analysis that was done by people at drug channels. The United States system is so discombobulated that it's very difficult to get an understanding of list prices versus net prices. Every year, list prices are what get published and are made public. The actual price that a company gets is far lower because in the United States, there are negotiations with insurance companies and pharmaceutical benefits managers, and there are rebates given, and where the rebates tend to go here in this country has been a black hole, although now Congress is starting to finally start to look at this and see if they can get a handle on this. But nevertheless, a group of drug channels went in and did some heavy duty analyses of company data, annual reports. And if you go through it, and they had roughly, I think, 10 companies that they did this for: Lilly, Janssen, Genentech, Merck, Novo Nordisk, Novartis, Sanofi, Takeda, and UCB. And out of these data, and I think this is very representative of most countries. And what you see here, of most companies, and what you see here is between 2017 and 2021, that there was list prices had gone up each year, although that was moderating, but list prices going up an average of anywhere from 6.6% in 2017, down as low as 2.9%, then up again in 2021. And I think 2022, that number is even higher than 3.4% list prices. But the actual net prices was dropping over this whole period. And yet people and politicians will say drug companies raise prices with abandon. Well, the list price gets increased each year, although I would argue not with abandon. This is basically inflationary rates, a little higher perhaps, inflationary rates here in the United States. But the actual money companies are getting less and less each year going forward. Next slide, please. And what people also fail to realize is that the cost of prescription drugs, while you get tremendous publicity around this, particularly around the more expensive gene therapies that are coming up, but even pills that are launched for rare disease drugs or cancer and the like, get a lot of attention. Yet the cost of prescription drugs is not the driver of increased healthcare costs. In the next slide, you can see, and this has been true for decades, and since about 2003 up through to 2018. These are data published by the New England Journal of Medicine, not exactly a major supporter of biopharma. And basically, as represented by I have trouble with colors, but what looks to be the blue bar is the prescription drugs make up about 12 to 13% of the annual healthcare spend. And that the fact is hospitals, physicians, dental costs, nursing homes, and other make up the large bulk of prescription costs. But this never gets any attention along the way. Now, I want to give an example of surgery in the United States, and I'll contrast this with Europe in a second. Hip replacement surgeries have been known for 80 years. The methodology is improved, but it's essentially the same as it's been. The type of hip is improved, and the quality of the hip replacements are. But basically, you're not talking about anything dramatic. The cost in the United States of a hip replacement is on the order of $40,000. And that doesn't include the nursing costs and extended nursing and rehabilitation costs. And about 400,000 hip replacements in the United States are performed each year. So in 2019, it's about $16 billion in costs. So, but it's an important surgery along the way. Now, let's contrast this, next slide, with what happens in Europe. And I put this up, particularly for my US audience, who tend to blame, say, well, you know, drugs cost way more in the United States, and the United States is really getting a raw deal in this regard. Well, that's part of the situation, is the crazy system we have in the United States. In fact, one of the learnings that occurred during the pandemic was Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, other companies sold vaccines directly to the government. And the government paid one simple price for it, much like happens in Europe and other places in the world. But nevertheless, that's not our system. But the cost of medical procedures in the United States versus Europe here, you can see drugs may cost as much as double in the United States than Europe, but hospital procedures are on the order of 4 times the amount. And that's just not for hip replacements, that's for knee replacements, and that's organ transplants across the board. That's the case. The whole US medical system is very expensive. And that's, I don't think, going to change along the way. Now, I'm going to contrast that to a drug in Lipitor. Lipitor is the next Pfizer drug. I may be a little biased. I take Lipitor every day myself to keep my cholesterol down, except that it's not Lipitor anymore. It's the generic name. Peak sales of Lipitor in 2007 hit about $13 billion, just under $13 billion. A year later, as the patent expired, there was a 95% drop in sales of brand name Lipitor. But generic Lipitor, atorvastatin, is still the third most prescribed drug in the United States. Third most prescriptions of Lipitor, because it is, atorvastatin is a wonderful, wonderful drug. It is estimated that statins have contributed to a 50% decline in deaths due to heart attacks and strokes. And this is a key point that again doesn't get recognized in this country, and I think around the world too. As you can see in the next slide, the point that I steal from Peter Kulczynski, who wrote a tremendous book called The Great American Drug Deal, is basically doctors and hospitals don't go generic. In fact, drugs going generic is the cost containment mechanism we have long had in the industry, and it's not appreciated by anybody. The fact of the matter is that companies have to, while the drug is on patent, have to make as much profits as possible, because your pipeline expires basically every 12 to 15 years. And not only do you have to grow your pipeline to replace those revenues, but shareholders demand revenues increase on the order of 5 to 10% a year. So you effectively have to reinvent yourself, plus almost 50% to 100% more doubling every 15 years. An unbelievable challenge that these companies face. And yet, that's not a worry for the rest of the healthcare system, where prices will go up without people seeming to pay a whole lot of attention for that. Now, another thing I have to deal with is that these drug companies are incredibly profitable. They make tons of money along the way. And unfortunately, the facts argue against this. So here are a bunch of, these are data from NYU Business School, Stern School, and the relative profitability of the top 25 sectors taken earlier this year. And you can't cry poverty for the pharmaceutical sector, but the fact, and to be honest, before the introduction of the vaccines and things like Paxlovid, the numbers for the drug industry was closer to 15% than the current 18%. Nevertheless, the thought that this industry is overly profitable is absurd, and is basically reflected in the stock price of a lot of companies. So here we have all these issues, and now we've got an enormous two crises that we're now facing as part of this industry. One is a huge patent cliff. So this is the Great American Drug Deal. It's the great drug deal that all the world has. And that as soon as these patents expire, you have generic competition and drugs become very cheap. And, I talked about Lipitor, atorvastatin before. It's literally pennies, literally, not exact, pennies per day a pill. It's cheaper than a Starbucks coffee going forward. It's an amazing situation we exist. But you have a huge patent cliff that it's got with $236 billion in sales going away in the next 6 years roughly. But then we have a bigger issue in this country, and that's the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it really should be called the Drug Price Control Act. And on the next slide, and I'm going to start now talking about the impact that this is going to have on drug R&D. And this is not just a US issue. This is going to affect the world. And I'm only going to talk about a small component about this on the R&D front. First of all, it allows for Medicare to negotiate prices. Negotiate is a poor word. They will dictate prices based on some people that they now have hired in Medicare, who will determine what the actual cost of the company producing that drug is, and then add maybe 10% on top of that, which is clearly not a type of pricing sustainable for these companies to really go on and make a significant profit. Now, this doesn't happen right away. This happens after a drug has been on the market for 9 years, although that's about when the drug starts peaking in sales, and there'll still be usually another for years or so of patent life. So this is going to eat into a lot of sales for a company. Interestingly, and I don't understand why this was done. I don't think anybody understands why this was done. The law says negotiations for large molecules, so antibodies, proteins, etc., will start 13 years after approval. Now, these obviously are not, maybe not so obviously, tend to be more expensive drugs. My suspicion is that they felt that the small molecule drugs were the bailiwick of the bigger companies, and the large molecule drugs were the bailiwick of biotech, smaller companies, which tend to have more of a favorable viewing by people who hate big pharma, which is actually a wrong viewing, however, and that's why this difference was put in place. Now they estimate that in the next 10 years, this will save Medicare $300 billion. It's a lot of money. Next slide, please. Now, this is going to severely limit pharma revenues for the older drugs, as I've mentioned, and it's already having an impact on research strategies for companies and research strategies for venture capitalists investing in biotech, small molecules, investing in the industry. You now, and let me give you an example of when I was doing my old job at Pfizer. If this had happened in my day, there would certainly have been a conversation at the highest level of the company with the marketing group, basically marketing people saying, and rightly so, hey, look, in terms of research, they would ask me, does it take more resources to do large molecule drugs than small molecule drugs? And the answer for me would be no, it's not. Usually at the discovery side, it's about the same. A lot of the costs going into R&D come from the clinical trials and how large a clinical trial has to be to support the filing package you would do with the FDA. But really, getting an antibody drug or small molecule drug, to be honest, tends to be roughly the same scale. I mean, there are always exceptions along the way. So the commercial people would then say, so why shouldn't we be doing more of large molecule stuff where we can be getting more favorable pricing, which happens a lot. There's a lot more competition in small molecule drug areas and large molecule drug areas, and in areas like oncology or rare diseases where you have a preponderance of large molecules, you can get more favorable pricing. Why shouldn't we be doing more large molecule drugs than small molecule drugs? And I would not have had a great answer for that. So I think there'll be less small molecule R&D going forward. And this is where it impacts the whole world, not just the United States, because this is where drugs come from. And so, well, not just drugs, but basically a large amount of the investment. Now, the ironic thing here is that small molecule drugs are cheaper to administer. You get a prescription, you go to the pharmacy and you fill it, you get it filled. Whereas large molecule drugs, you might have to get infusions at healthcare centers or hospitals or doctors' offices, and you add a whole lot more costs. And so I think that venture capitalists are also starting to look at shifting areas. Now, I think this is going to cause a loss of jobs in biopharma R&D. Next slide, please. Because unlike any other industry, pharma invests 25% of top line revenues into R&D. So I already mentioned that in the next 10 years, there'll be $300 billion loss in revenues. Well, that's going to result in $75 billion less in R&D funding within these companies. Across the board, obviously, it's not just one company, across the board, but $75 billion less in R&D funding. Well, in the end, that's a pretty significant amount of money. And in each year, that's like 2 years worth of investment for the NIH. Next slide, please. So let me give you, it's an older example, but let me give you something that actually I had to undergo in running R&D some years ago now. My budget in my budget, that's the royal me speaking, I guess. The budget we had that we had for R&D in 2006 was $5 billion. And going into 2007, when I had meetings with the leadership team, I said basically to continue the programs we were going to run, I was going to need we were going to need a 10% increase in the budget because we had a lot of phase 3 programs we were starting to invest. We were just about, however, to lose the Lipitor patent, and we had the loss of a major and highly promising, totally new cardiovascular drug in late stage phase 3 trials, which was supposed to be even better than Lipitor. And so the CEO and CFO said we have to right size R&D going forward for the size scale of sales we're going to have. And so they said, no, not only not a 10% increase, but in fact, a $500 million decrease for 2007. And some cynics will say, well, you got a lot of fluff in your budget and things. You can figure this out. Well, the fact of the matter is we had gone through two major integrations, mergers, one with Warner Lambert in 2000, one with Pharmacia in 2004, that led to a lot of cost cutting to justify those mergers, and which were the cost cutting were referred to euphemistically as synergies. And basically, we've gone through two major total reevaluations of the whole company, not just R&D, but particularly R&D. And so there was no real fluff to take out. So how did we make up essentially $1 billion gap instead of 5.5 billion to 4.5 billion? And this is what we actually did. Next slide, please. We ended up cutting research sites around the globe. Japan, France, our major site that we had, major European site that we had in Sandwich, England. We closed the Ann Arbor labs, the legacy labs of Warner Lambert Park Davis, 2,200 jobs taken out. We got out of key therapeutic areas, cardiovascular. Well, we had Lipitor and Norvasc, neurosciences, Zoloft and Lyric, infectious diseases, Zithromax, Diflucan, and we got totally out of allergy and respiratory diseases. Now, why do I put this up? Well, companies are going to have to respond to lower revenues. They're not going to just continue to invest 30 or 35% of top line. Right? They have to respond. And so you're going to see now ripple effects going across the industry. And you're already hearing and seeing this, cuts, not just in small companies, but large companies. Pfizer, this past few months, got out of rare disease research, and that was housed in their labs in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so those scientists were out of a job. That's Pfizer. And so this is already happening all through the industry. So despite the unbelievable achievements of biopharma R&D in fighting COVID-19, the ability of the industries to discover new breakthroughs are now going to be handicapped at a time when you've got tremendous insights into disease, at a time when you've got tremendous opportunities to do well and to come up with cures along the way. You're seeing venture capitalists invest less in biopharma. You're seeing companies starting to cut back. It's a really tough time we're going through. Ironically, in fact, when everything should be better. So I close with a slide from a quote that was in a letter to the New York Times by a former Democratic, although some years ago now, presidential candidate Howard Dean. He was head of the Democratic National Committee for many years. The quote is somewhat old, but it still holds. And the American drug industry is the most successful, innovative in the world, and it's most expensive because we're the country that pays true research and development costs for the world. But schemes to launch a federal attack on the last growing innovative industries in the United States are counterproductive to job creation and, more important, to the health of human beings around the world. Need to reduce the cost of drugs, yes, but advances in drug efficacy and scope have saved far more in hospital costs than we've spent on drugs. And that's where I will end. And I'd be happy to take any questions that people have.
Thank you so much, John, for this very interesting presentation. Always enjoyed your very, very insightful presentation. So maybe we can start with a question from the founder of Basel HCD, Salman, who couldn't be here with us today because of some other commitments. So I'm going to read out his question. And it says that despite continuing to spend billions on R&D, and tell us whether you agree with this or not. The pharma biz model is failing to deliver innovation, which is largely coming from nimbler and innovative biotech companies, for example, MSD's Keytruda, in bracket and academia. Why is that, and can pharma fix its innovation problems? That is the first question.
So thanks, Solomon. I really appreciate that. I wish you were here to hear my answer going forward. So first of all, it would be pretty arrogant for a company like Pfizer, which has on the order of, and Pfizer and Roche and most of the big companies have R&D budgets now on the order of $10 billion a year. Despite that large amount of money, it would be pretty arrogant on their part to think that they would corner the market in terms of good ideas and work going forward. So, and since when I started in Pfizer back in the late 70s, roughly half of Pfizer's revenues, and I think this is not unique, most companies are saying, came from drugs discovered outside the company. In those days, the drugs were coming from small Japanese companies that didn't have a global presence. I know some small German companies we licensed things from along the way. That has not changed. The difference has been that biotech industry has risen to sort of take the place of what smaller pharmaceutical companies would do. So you're always looking to get great ideas. The thought that these new drugs don't come out of big pharma, homegrown discovery is somewhat ludicrous. Certainly, a lot of the cancer, and I know Pfizer's pipeline better. Even though I've been out for 15 years, I still follow this stuff. Our oncology compounds, for example, have come out of there. Certainly, Paxlovid has come out of our stuff. So, but I'd say roughly half of the pipeline comes from internal, and the rest is developed on the biotech industry. And if you pay any attention to biotech, you'll notice that 90% of these companies fail. Just in the last week, there are half a dozen companies that have gone out of business. One is a company that I was tangentially involved with, Morphimmune, has had to merge with Immunome, a company I was on the board of, to keep going. A company, I'm familiar with the microbiome space, a company called Series, which launched the first microbiome product for C. difficile, has had to lay off 40% of their staff and will have to do more probably because of the launches not going well, going forward. So look, let's not denigrate big pharma. And yes, big pharma plays a pretty big role in helping take a biotech company's idea and actually bringing that to fruition, having the wherewithal to do the late stage trials and subsequent sales and marketing, et cetera. So there's a balance in the equilibrium, but I do bristle, and I'll have to send Solomon a nasty email after we get done about denigrating the industry. There is a tremendous amount of innovation that goes on in big pharma as compared to biotech. You need both.
Okay, all right. So Philip Sen from Hong Kong has posted these questions. Could you address the role PBM companies play, and what are the impacts on drug prices? So how do you see the role of PBMs in blaming pharma?
Well, so, and again, the Congress now is finally realizing this. Novo Nordisk, I think it was, a couple of years back at conferences, put out a little blurb about insulin prices. And they showed that over a 5-year period, the net price of what they were getting for insulin, their insulin analogs, it's not insulin, the great insulin analogs that they developed. I think Lantus is theirs, but I might have that one wrong. Over a 5-year period, the actual amount of money that they got for their insulin was dropping every year, a lot like what I showed on the cost slide earlier. Every year it was dropping, but the net price, the list price that people were paying went higher and higher. And that's because of the negotiations, because there were a variety of insulin analogs that were available. in order to keep your insulin and a formulary, a favorable position on the formulary, you had to raise the list price, and then they negotiated a lower price. But what no one was actually got was a lot less. Now, for most people in the United States, that's not as big an issue. And then of course, the PBMs basically keep the money, because the PBMs also have to grow their revenues every year, and they don't produce any content really. They can only make money by keeping more money out of these rebates. So that's how they stay in business and do well. But that was all largely invisible to the public. Now, I say it didn't impact people a lot, because the PBMs negotiate with the companies for their insurance. And so anybody who has decent insurance in the United States, which is the vast majority of people in the United States, do okay and didn't really feel that impact too much, other than a copay. The people who really got screwed were people who have no insurance, which, and amazingly, unlike Europe, 10% of Americans have no insurance. And so maybe you should fix that problem. Or another 5% have crummy insurance with high copays. Maybe you should fix that problem, Congress, as opposed to some of these other things. So how much of a problem PBMs have? Yeah, it's a big deal. It's starting to be looked at. It's not appreciated by the public, and it really impacts the reputation of companies here in the United States. The fact of the matter is, one of the big things, and I agree with this, the Inflation Reduction Act put a cap on insulin price. That's such a lightning rod here in this country, insulin prices, that nobody can pay more than $35 a month for their insulin, which I think is great and should be done. 75% of Americans before the Inflation Reduction Act were paying less than $35 a month for their insulin. Nobody knows that. They know Bernie Sanders taking a busload of elderly people to Canada to get their insulin there because it was cheap. So anyway, I can go on about insulin for another hour, and I won't bore you with it.
Thank you, John. So we have a question from one of our members, Amit Ambarkhane, and the question is, well, he's saying, first of all, thank you for the insightful presentation. How could a startup stage companies deal with IRA and its impact on fundraising and prioritizing the clinical development?
Yeah, that's a great point. Great question. I think, so first of all, venture capitalists have been not investing as much in the last few years. As you know, there have been no IPOs started for 2 years now, or very few, if any, because the money has sort of dried up. Why has the money dried up? Because venture capitalists didn't know before the IRA was going, and they still don't have a full feel on, I think, the impact of the IRA. Certainly, not totally naive, they know, but seeing how all this plays out and what drugs were going to be. So the IRA, the first year is negotiating for 10 drugs. Next year is 15. The year after is 15. In the 30, and only small molecule drugs right now, not large molecule. It won't be till the third year where they'll start negotiating for large molecule drugs, which is, again, is stupid. The large molecule drugs are the most expensive ones. But nevertheless, the VC money is dried up. And my guess is that they'll be looking to invest more where a greater return can be gotten. And I think the greater return, as I said earlier, is likely going to be for more of the large molecule drugs. So small molecule drug companies are having challenges. They're looking actually to big pharma companies for investment in any kind of fundraising that they're doing. So each company, there's Pfizer Ventures, there's Lilly Ventures, Roche, J&J's got a big venture group, and they're investing in a lot of different things to help sustain the venture the biotech world, to deliver the sort of things that hopefully we'll be able to see along the way.
Great. And I have a question myself, John. So you mentioned in one of your slides, and I'm just looking at one of the slides, and there was it says that drug companies, well, not this question. Okay, Pfizer took no money from US government for vaccine development, right? And then you mentioned that it invested $2 billion at risk in an unproven technology, and I agree with that. But the fact that the point that Pfizer took no money from US government for vaccine, that seems to be contradictory to what you mentioned about NIH providing funding. On slide 6, you mentioned that the real work of drug R&D is done by NIH and industry simply manufactures new medicine. Is it the implication of some?
So what
Okay.
I meant by that was that people think, the public thinks that it's the NIH and academic institutions that really do the drug discovery, and that very little goes on in big pharma. And when I talk about this in a more formal, longer presentation, I give a couple of exact examples of where the nature of the interaction between the NIH and a big company exists. So for many years, the government at one time had thousands of patents, and nobody was working on them. And the reason nobody was working on them was commercial companies were not working on. The reason they weren't working on it was because the government insisted that should anything come out of it, they would get royalties and march-in rights to these sort of drugs. And so finally, there was a law passed in the United States to say, this is stupid. We invest in this stuff, and nobody is picking up on it. And so they changed the laws such that the NIH should be able to give non-exclusive rights to these patents to different companies. And that's where a lot of this exploded, and that's where a lot of biotech was able to come into play here. And I use the example of Xeljanz. Xeljanz was internal work we discovered. It's a great story. A Pfizer scientist goes to a meeting. He meets a friend of his from the NIH. They do it most scientific meetings. They discuss what they're working on. And the NIH scientist was working on something called bubble boy syndrome. Bubble boy syndrome is where you're born without an immune system, and you live literally in a bubble. And the scientist, a fellow named John O'Shea, found that there was something missing in these people which controlled their immune system, which was called a kinase called Janus kinase, Jack. And the Pfizer scientist was interested in looking for drugs to dampen down the immune system for all sorts of diseases, inflammation disease, rheumatoid arthritis, irritable inflammatory bowel disease, psoriasis, etc. And so he licensed reagents from the NIH to start a program where we'd look for inhibitors of this pathway, because everybody normally has this immune system, part of the system, and in people with immunological diseases, their immune system's overactive. So he thought, well, maybe we'll come up with something that blocks this pathway, and maybe we'd have something that could treat all these immune diseases. And so it took 15 years, over $1 billion, $1.5 billion, and that was the first JAK inhibitor, Xeljanz. There are now dozens of compounds on the market to treat JAK diseases. Different types of, turns out, different members of the family, different uses, etc. And you're bombarded in the United States with commercials for all these drugs, in fact. But all that came out of some very nice basic work out of the NIH that came up with a thought, an unproven hypothesis that scientists, and this happens in biopharma, big pharma, biotech, etc., to come up with new diseases. So I'm not belittling the contributions of the NIH. They're very important, but 95% of what the NIH works on doesn't work, doesn't go anywhere, right? So you need, it's the biopharmaceutical industry that proves or disproves medical hypotheses. It doesn't happen any other place, and that takes resources and that takes money. And again, one other thing I want to say about the people who say, well, the NIH really did the basic research for mRNA vaccines. The fact of the matter is that it was venture capitalists that funded a lot of this. Moderna was in business for a decade before they came up with anything. In fact, they needed money from Operation Warp Speed in the government. They had no manufacturing facilities. They had no revenues at all. Who funded Moderna for a decade? Venture capitalists and investors. And the same thing can be said for biotech. So venture capitalists should be getting as much credit as anybody along the way here.
So we have a question from Peter Gronen. And I think that question is same line of the question that Billy is sharing. So Peter is asking, on the number recently published, actually only 28% of new drugs comes out of internal R&D from major pharmaceutical companies. But the question is more on the sustainability of the total industry. Efficiency is poor and choices for unmet medical needs are not always ethical, but more commercial. How to resolve this? Then another question by Ambly is that, as you alluded to, there is a big trust deficit among patients and the other key stakeholders. What more do you think we need to do to build trust with society?
Oh boy, let's go with the first one. Can we be real here? Companies have to be profitable. Probably they don't exist if they don't. All right, so you have to make money along the way. I bristle when people talk about, well, all big companies do are Me Too drugs. That somebody comes up with something, and then other companies will rush to make more, to make analogs and just capitalize on it. Well, first of all, no one drug in the class is suitable for all people. So this thought of Me Too drugs, looking at diversity just on this call, young, old, people from different nationalities, genetic backgrounds, etc. You'd be surprised that one drug doesn't work the same in all of us. I know people who can't take Lipitor despite its great safety because they get migraines. It's maybe 1/100% of people. So you need choices for people along the way. Two, one thing that helps in drug pricing is actually having choices. When a PBM or insurance companies can say, well, yeah, you guys have this drug, but I can have 2 or 3 choice of a couple of others, that brings the price down. And that's particularly important in areas with very expensive oncology drugs where you need competition. And as I said earlier, so you need multiple drugs along the way to help people, because not one drug doesn't work for everybody. But yes, you need, now the other thing is, this is fascinating also. 10, 12 years ago, the bigger companies didn't go after rare disease drugs. And the reason is that it was thought you wouldn't be able to get pricing in probably a little bit longer, maybe 15 years ago. And so the rare disease drugs were left for people, smaller company, biotech companies. But once the ability to get rare disease pricing came to play. Rare disease drugs turn out to be, you don't have to sell, multiple $1 billion of a rare disease drug, particularly if it's a drug population that's, maybe 10,000 people globally, because the patient advocacy groups tend to be very strong for these groups. They'll help let people know you've got if you're successful and you have a drug for their rare diseases. They'll help recruit patients for your trials. It turns out to be a very interesting part of the world, part of the therapeutic area to be in. But it has to turn a profit in order to work there. But that has led to a renaissance of rare disease drugs research. Now you may say, well, why shouldn't these companies be using their resources to come up with drugs that will affect millions and not thousands? Well, you have a rare disease, you may want to counterbalance that argument. You may say, what about me? So again, it comes to a balance of things. What are you going to do about the negative view of the industry? The very first thing I wrote for Forbes 12, 13 years ago was drug companies should stop direct-to-consumer advertising. I think that tends to have a negative effect on the industry, even though that drug consumer advertising can be helpful for patients. It certainly makes people aware that there are drugs that treat their disease out there. There's certain neuroinflammatory diseases that people had that didn't know that there was a drug out there till the advertisements that were drug, didn't tout a drug just yet, but said there's something on the market for you now, help. And the drug ads help increase sales. And as an R&D guy, you sell another $1 billion in sales. That's another $250 million for me in research. So, but having said that, the negative taste in people's mouth is such that maybe be better off being like the rest of the world and not having direct-to-consumer advertising. Will that make a big difference? It might make a small difference, but we have to balance whether or not that's useful with the downsides of not doing that. I thought, as I said at the outset, the pandemic could finally convince people the importance of the industry and say, you know what, these people are okay. And now the latest Gallup poll has gone back down to its lowest levels. We don't get credit for the work we do. We're too much of a whipping boy for politicians. Maybe the drug prices now for Medicare will change that. But until you're in a situation where you have universal care coverage for drugs among everybody, people will, because people see you go to a pharmacy, you see your prescription drug price, which, by the way, is different in different pharmacies in different neighborhoods, and even big cities like New York. So there's no one price. Pharmacies charge different things, but nobody knows that either, right? Until we get to a situation where people, like they do when they go to a hospital, they don't really see a bill. They don't know that a price of a Lipitor or a atorvastatin in their, in the United States, you go to a hospital, you can't bring your own prescriptions. They won't let you take your stuff. They will say, what do you take? And they will give you theirs. And a pill of atorvastatin will cost $1 or $2 instead of a penny or $2. So, I mean, there's all this stuff. Nobody knows this sort of stuff. And until the politicians find some other place to whip other industries to whip, will continue to get that. So I'm basically hand waving here. I don't have great ideas to do this. I thought this would have already happened, and it didn't.
Thank you, John. So I know that we are almost there, but there is a question. I think Lauren was raising her hand. So Lauren, please, if you have a question.
Sure, I put it down again because I thought we were at time. But thanks, John, for your wonderful presentation and your book and everything else you do. I guess the sort of concern from a humanistic standpoint is, like, if we are going to have less R&D investment overall across the industry in general, but we have the evolving demographics, we're getting older, the burden is, it's going to be even greater. Like, how do we tackle this? Is it about trying to demonstrate the value more, and actually more the burden, and better data to support that, from the other side? So when you do come to negotiations and to demonstrating the value for potential innovations, that the baseline is there, because that's what I understand is missing.
Well, boy, Lauren, it's a great topic. And the irony here is that companies may avoid drugs that would only be used by 65 and older in favor of drugs that would be used by a broader population, because that's the one that the negotiations will start for. So in fact, you're driving things away from where it should be. Part of the thing I see some companies doing are now reinvesting in Alzheimer's disease. And obviously that's an older person's disease, and dementia, for the humanitarian reasons you just said, and potentially for reasonable pricing, potentially, because the initial drug that came out of Biogen was just outrageously priced and fell on its face. Whereas people are saying now that the Lilly drug for Alzheimer's that's priced, at least the list price is around $25,000, is a reasonable price. And groups like ICER have said, that's fair. That's a fair price for this drug. And so with that sort of a situation happening, you can see, at least for that segment of the elderly population, stuff happening. The drugs that are already on the market are non-generic for blood pressure and diabetes and heart disease, lipids, et cetera, are benefiting the older population now. And I know a lot of people in my baby boomer demographic who are on generic, all sorts of generic blood pressure and lipid medication, et cetera, just for that reason. So anyway, it's also not a great answer to your question, but I think some of that is happening, maybe not enough.
So thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. We are almost at the end of our session. So the recording of this session will be available on our LinkedIn page and available to our members. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate this. Great presentation always. And thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me, everybody. Like
Thank
being
you.
part of this.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.